Good afternoon. Welcome to our October speaker series and the very important topic of workplace accommodations for your rare condition. Before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Annexon, CSL, Arginex, and Grifols for supporting the speaker series program. I'd like to also welcome our guest speaker today, Michelle Deering. Michelle is a member of our board of directors. She is also a GBS survivor, and she's very active in many of our patient programs and advocacy initiatives. So welcome, Michelle, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Maureen. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today.
Absolutely. So Michelle, before we get started with our questions that have come directly from our members and our patients, can you tell us a little bit about your own experience with accommodations in your own workplace, you know, the good, the positive, and maybe the sometimes negative things that happened to you?
Absolutely. So it was definitely a roller coaster journey with ups and downs.
Mhm.
I not only am a GBS survivor, but also I'm currently a CIDP patient. So when I addressed my employer about accommodations, it was during a time in which, you know, I was relatively newly diagnosed with CIDP, perhaps maybe like a year out. And I was definitely, having a lot of flare ups, things of that nature. My neurologist had placed me on an infusion regimen. So I was getting IVIG at home for several hours. So there came a time where, with my job, I did quite a bit of traveling, do have an office job. Um, so, having some difficulty with, fatigue, doing a lot of typing, and, particularly in the morning times, seemed like my symptoms would be a little bit more heightened during those periods of time. And just trying to figure out, how best to be able to meet not only my neurologist appointments, but, getting my infusions, because at that time, my treatment regimen consisted of, a 5 day initial loading dose. And thereafter, I would get infusions usually about every 3 weeks. And one infusion would last anywhere from 6 hours to 8 hours. And, for those patients who've had to get IVIG treatments, sometimes it lasts a little bit longer. You may have some reactions and things. So I certainly needed that flexibility. And at the time that I approached my employer, um, about the need for accommodations, um, I was, like I mentioned, traveling a lot. They were not aware of my medical condition at the time.
Mm.
So, the first thing that I did was try to arm myself with, information. How do I have this discussion? What do I exactly disclose to them? And, obviously, with this being a rare disease, I went to the foundation's webpage and, utilized that description to talk to my employer about what this condition is so they have a better understanding, which was really helpful. And, it wasn't an easy process. I was, in fact, the first employee who had requested an accommodation. So, they were really looking to me to provide some suggestions on what type of accommodations I needed. In addition, I had to take an active role having these conversations with my neurologist
Mm.
because there were quite a few forms that I needed to fill out, and making sure that I was providing the appropriate information without necessarily, oversharing to the extent that I didn't have to. So, ultimately, some of my accommodations resulted in a period of time where I had a reduced work schedule, which in turn, created taking that reduced schedule for reduced pay. So, as a single individual, that was um, quite a big deal for me. But I knew that, I needed to try to keep this job so that I had the appropriate health care to get the actual care that I needed.
Yeah. Yeah. So Michelle, let me ask you this. I'm going to go back to the paperwork that you had mentioned with your doctor. So did your employer require you to have like a doctor's note or a doctor's summary of your condition, or did they ask you to provide some sort of proof of your condition?
Sure, great question. So I want to give some context to my dialogue with my employer. First, there are different accommodations that you can ask for, right? So um, and let me start out by saying that accommodations are something that you can ask for based upon a federal law called the American with Disabilities Act. And that act states that if you have a qualified medical impairment, it doesn't have to be, um, it needs to just be able to like limit your ability to perform certain functions of your job. But you need to provide at least some level of information to your employer so that they can understand that, uh, this isn't like the flu, right? For example, it's, perhaps a chronic condition for which, you may have symptoms that come in and flow. So, in order to get the accommodations I needed, I did have to disclose, um, you know, that I had a neurological condition. My neurologist, I did disclose my diagnosis. It's not necessarily required, but you do have to give sufficient information for your employer to understand what your limitations are, how frequent you may have symptoms or limitations. So I worked with my neurologist to draft a letter that, explained, I'd been his patient, since 2010, that, I was required to have an infusion regimen, and just in the same way that I've shared with you, that frequency. He went into some of the residuals that I have, such as excessive fatigue, numbness, tingling in my hands and feet. And that allowed my employer to kind of understand perhaps some ways that we might be able to make accommodations. So for me, with the fatigue, I was able to request telework as an accommodation,
Yeah.
so that gave me an opportunity to take breaks and rest, or, particularly for me in the mornings, I noticed that some of my symptoms would be heightened in the morning.
Yeah.
So therefore I didn't have to have, going into the office for a long commute. Flexibility in when my start and end times were was something else that I negotiated. And then the ability to take what's called intermittent leave. And intermittent leave is something that an employee can seek under what's called the Family Medical Leave Act, which is also a federal law. Now, with FMLA is what I'm going to call it.
Yeah.
That provision is regulated by the Department of Labor. All employers are not subjected to FMLA leave. FMLA leave is only for those employers with 50 employees or more.
Okay.
Plus, the employee has to have worked for that employer for at least 12 months. And typically, you need to have worked like, I think it's like 1,200 or so, basically, roughly equate to like 24 hours per week with the employer to qualify, which I did in my case. I had been with my employer for many years, so that wasn't really an issue for me. And when you seek FMLA leave, it is 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And I utilize that leave in order to get my infusions, right? Or if I had neurological symptoms at home and for which I just wanted, an hour or two
Yeah.
of leave while I'm working, or also to go to various doctor's appointments. So, you know, much like other conditions, you can either take that leave in a big bulk,
Yeah.
or it could be based upon, a set period of time, perhaps like an hour, 2 hour increments. But that's something that you can certainly work with your employer on, depending upon your specific needs.
Situation. So let me ask you this. If you are in a situation where you're in between jobs and you are looking for a job, do you recommend that the person disclose their condition during the interview? Is there any legalities around withholding it, or any advice on that? So you're,
Yeah, sure. So, I'm not able to provide legal advice, but
yeah.
I can share with you my own personal experience
Mm,
of,
okay.
what I decided to do. It's certainly a personal decision.
Mhm.
Um, and, I would encourage patients to consider looking at some online resources that are available to kind of educate yourself about what your rights are, and what your obligations are and what you need to disclose. So, for purposes of seeking an accommodation or, well, you wouldn't qualify for FMLA leave, right? So, because you hadn't been at your employer for 12 months, but under the ADA, you know, you're not legally required to disclose that you have any type of disability. In fact, in the interviewing phase, an employer is not permitted to ask you any disability related questions. What comes to play is at that job offer. At the job offer, an employer can ask you disability related questions if they do so for all those who hold your position. So think of, perhaps a police officer, right? Or certain jobs that have a physical fitness test.
Yeah.
And so they're able to get into whether you can physically perform the job with or without an accommodation. So, for me, I did not disclose, um, at the time, of my interview with my employer, just because, there are times where, you know, unfortunately, sometimes discrimination does exist in the
Yeah.
workplace. And I rather side on the air of caution. So I didn't disclose until, I needed an accommodation, which
Yeah.
was several years down the road.
That's good. That's good advice for those out there who are not in a, kind of a solid situation right now. Um, so let's talk a little bit about accommodations themselves. What is considered a reasonable, you had mentioned the phrase reasonable accommodation a few times. What can you give us like an outline of what you would consider to be reasonable accommodation specifically for CIDP?
Sure. So with CIDP, and related variants, typically a lot of the functional limitations could be fatigue, numbness, tingling, perhaps mobility issues, um, brain fog, right? So, certain level of cognitive impairment is possible. Each individual is unique, right? So, the way this um, condition shows up for some may be a little slightly different than others. But just generally speaking, we'll assume those are the types of impairments that are associated with this condition. So the law says a reasonable accommodation. It means that the accommodation is not going to subject the employer to undue burden. And those are actually legal words. Undue burden could be such that it's just cost prohibitive. Like, it's going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars to provide the accommodation requested. And I do want to share, with patients that your employer is not required to provide the accommodation that you request,
Hmm.
but they're required to provide an accommodation that gets to the heart of your limitations. Okay.
Yeah.
So, let's think about a CID patient, and I'll share with you some of the accommodations that I requested.
Yeah.
So, with
Great.
respect to my numbness and tingling, which sometimes would impact my ability to type,
Hmm.
I requested and did receive it's called Dragon software. That's kind of like a voice to text software ability. There may be others out there as well. So that could be a reasonable accommodation. It wasn't, terribly expensive. It wasn't something that created a hardship on my employer. Um, I also had an accommodation that um, non-essential functions of my job were relieved from me. So, for example, I did volunteer work with a part of my job, kind of like took on some extra work because that really wasn't part of my official job.
Yeah.
They reassign that to someone else. So
Mm.
that can be an accommodation. In fact, reassigning an employee to a new job that's available can be an accommodation. I got telework as an accommodation because historically my employer did not permit telework. And, now that we're in a post COVID environment, I think telework is more open to employers to
Yeah.
embrace and grant.
Yeah.
That may be something. And also, like I said, you might be able to have unpaid leave under the Federal Family Medical Leave Act.
Yeah.
Or if your employer is not um, required to follow that act because they don't have the number of employees at play, or you haven't been at your employer for long enough
Mhm.
to qualify, you could still certainly get and request unpaid leave
Mm.
as an accommodation.
Mm.
If you have mobility issues, maybe it's making sure that the entranceway is accessible, for
Yeah.
example. Um, there could be um, breaks throughout the day as
Yeah.
an accommodation,
Yeah.
um, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And in fact, I utilize a website that's a wonderful resource called the Job Accommodation Network. It's a free website, and they actually will provide um, consults to employees and to employers
Mm.
to try to identify types of accommodations that may work for a particular circumstance. So it's a really great resource. In fact, if you go to their website, they have a free employee guide. There's also a function there that you can tap, what your limitation is. Let's say you have a hearing impairment or, you have fatigue. They will have um, potential accommodations that could address that. So it's a really good resource. It's something that I utilized, and so definitely encourage others to tap into that free resource.
That's great. So is there anything that kind of jumps in your mind that would be considered maybe an unreasonable accommodation? So for instance, if you work for a smaller company, maybe the building isn't ADA compliant, could you ask for them to install a ramp or something like that? What
Yeah,
would you do in
so
those
the
situations?
installation of a ramp may be unduly burdensome,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for a small business. I'm sure it's thousands and thousands of dollars
Yeah.
to do that. So I could certainly see where that could be a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Other accommodations that may be unduly burdensome is to take away an essential function of your job. So, for example, if you work at a call center,
Mm-hmm.
right? And part of your duties is to, accept calls, from 9 to 5 per day, and a request to not have to take calls, but you'll go and make copies for people.
Yeah.
That's probably not going to be one in which the employer would be open to granting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the burden is on the employee actually to try to come up with suggestions for an accommodation that is tailored
Yeah.
to their particular limitations.
Yeah. And that's actually why webinars like this are good and talking to your neurologist, because you can kind of come up with that list preemptively, of
Right.
accommodations to ask for. So I'm going to read a couple questions that had come in from members in the past few years. Actually, we get a lot of questions about workplace accommodations. So the first one, which is kind of a tough one, but I'm going to throw it at you. How can I be certain I don't lose my job? Is there any way to guarantee that you're not going to be let go once you disclose your condition and ask for accommodations?
That's a tough one. There is no guarantee that
Mhm.
you won't lose your job. However, as I had mentioned before, there are laws at the federal level, such as the American with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which prohibits discrimination based upon disability, whether it's an actual disability or perceived disability. So, um, employers are prohibited from doing that, and whether it be um, termination, hiring, job duties, reassignment,
Mhm.
um, impacting your fringe benefits, things of that nature. So, I would say if you've disclosed your disability to your employer and in the context of perhaps, seeking an accommodation, then I would encourage you to visit an attorney, perhaps one that specializes in labor and employment matters, or a disability lawyer. Also, there's a lot of wonderful free resources. For example, you can go to the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which
Mhm.
is a federal agency
Mhm.
that is tasked with ensuring that those who fall with under the protection of these federal laws are not discriminated against. And there's a host of resources there, of, what do you do if you think you've been discriminated against, or,
Mhm.
for example, terminated due to asking for an accommodation. So there's certainly no guarantee that, unfortunately, you may be subjected to that, but there are resources available, and there are, potentially remedies
Yeah.
to being in those certain circumstances. And I would say, you're just going to have to use your judgment in terms of whether and when to disclose your disability.
Um, so the next question, I think you probably answered it, so I'll ask it a different way. Um, what are the requirements to disclose your disability? And what are the feelings? I'm sorry, what do you do when there's feelings of discrimination, whether perceived or actual? So what's the first thing that you should do if you feel like you're being discriminated against? Would it be contact a lawyer? Would it be go to some of these free resources? What are their steps to take right now if they feel like they're being
Yeah, so if
discriminated
you think
against?
that you've been discriminated against, I would, one, contact and look at some of those free resources. Two, I would probably have a free consult with a disability or employee law
Mhm.
attorney to kind of get a sense of, what your rights are, you know, kind of talk about your particular circumstance as well. And then, depending upon, the unique circumstances that you're faced with, there may become a time that you need to consult with your HR. But
Yeah.
before going to HR, I would probably first chat with, an attorney,
Mhm.
and then also perhaps look at some of the resources with the EEOC.
Yeah. Is there free legal advice? Is there any websites that would offer free legal advice?
I can't think of right off the top of my head, but what I will say is that there may also be a state equivalent
Yeah.
to the EEOC, because there are state and local laws that may also get in this arena as well.
Mhm.
Another resource, though, for potential legal advice could be, a lot of states do have a legal aid service. A lot of times those can be income based. So that's a resource to look into, to see if you qualify for that. In addition, um, most all states have what's called their state bar. The state bar may offer free resources and free legal consults, or they may have a directory of attorneys that they can link you to that may provide either pro bono, which means free,
Right.
or reduce rates when providing legal advice. So that's definitely another avenue to look into.
Great. How about social workers? Can social workers help you to fight for these accommodations? Does it make sense to connect with a social worker when you're sort of going through, trying to figure these situations out?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, actually, yeah, a social worker could be another resource to tap
mhm,
into. I don't, they're not going to be able to provide legal advice,
right.
but I think that they could be certainly an asset to navigate and perhaps get you to the right resources and identify
Yeah.
where those resources are
Yeah.
along this journey.
Hmm. So final question here, does it make sense to, or have you ever been asked to have one of your physicians or healthcare providers contact your employer other than just writing something up? Have they ever actually had a conversation about it? Is that something that people do or health providers seem
It's
available to do?
it's not common. I
Okay.
would, for me personally, that was not my experience.
Mm-hmm.
My experience was that a letter from my neurologist
Yeah.
was sufficient
Yeah.
for both my accommodations and also for my FMLA leave, because there are required forms for FMLA leave that your physician must provide. I think the best course would be to, if your employer has additional questions, to have your employer, maybe provide a written list of questions that you
Yeah.
can take to your provider, and that way, because as I said, while the employer, once you're in the job
Mhm.
and you're seeking these accommodations or FMLA leave, they may have follow-up questions, but I think the best course is to channel that through your conversations with your provider rather than giving your employer full access, because there's HIPAA and
Yeah, that's
privacy
true.
issues
Mhm.
that could be at play.
True.
So it's just something that you want to be, mindful of. And further, when you are seeking leave under FMLA or an accommodation, there's no requirement that you disclose all of your medical conditions,
Yeah.
right? It's only going to be for the condition for which you're seeking leave or an accommodation.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to accommodations, there may be a benefit for an employee to disclose more than their GBS or CIDP or MMN, because let's say, for example, you have, one of these neurological conditions, but in addition to that, perhaps you have uh, a condition where you have to also get dialysis, for example, right?
Yeah.
So, you've got limitations related to that condition that's prompting you to have dialysis, and maybe you want to be able to telework because, you can bunch your doctor's visits for your neurological condition, and perhaps if you have infusions, and
Yeah.
then, you're also going to get dialysis treatments outside
Mhm.
of your home. So it may, present a stronger argument
Yeah.
for why particular accommodations would suit you best, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And the doctor would also, I think, be able to, clearly articulate the types of treatments and the types of mechanics of the treatments and what kind of work can actually be done while people are getting the treatment. Some people actually work
Right.
straight through their infusions, right? Um,
Right. Which is actually was part of my accommodation request was, you know, I explained, hey, I'll be able to do some work,
yeah.
maybe not, all of it, but I could certainly do some work, check emails,
Yeah.
things of that nature while I was infusing at home,
Right.
which was, a great benefit for me,
Right.
because I wanted to ensure that I stayed employed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you don't know until you try it either. That's another thing. You might think you can't work during the infusions, but then you find that it's fine. It's not distracting at all, you know?
And that's a good point that you
Yeah.
raised, Maureen, because, in this whole, space of accommodations,
Mm-hmm.
you may try an accommodation and it ultimately doesn't
Don't
work.
need it.
And
Yeah.
so it's going to be an ongoing conversation with your employer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you might think, the voice to text might work, but then you come to find out, hey, you may no longer need it. Maybe after you might receive some improvement from your
Exactly.
infusions or other medication treatment, or it might be, you know what, it's really not getting to the limitations that I have. And so it's going to be incumbent upon the employee to say, and go to their employer and say, I really appreciate, your willingness to approve this accommodation, but it's not working.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the employer will actually want to have a scheduled check-in just to see how things are going.
Yeah.
Um,
Good idea.
and I think that's probably a good idea because it
Yeah.
gives the employee an opportunity to share, what's working, what's not working,
Right.
and it gives the employer, more information on ways that they can accommodate.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, it's a situation where there's ebbs and flows, right? So sometimes you dial up the accommodations, sometimes you don't need them as much, but it's good going in to know kind of what your rights are and what you might be looking at, what kind of adaptations that you do need. So Michelle, let's talk about caregivers for a second. There's a huge burden and challenge, obviously, for the patients, but it's not singularly for them, it's for the whole family, right? And their caregivers. So are there any accommodations in the workplace that would be available for caregivers?
Wow, what a great
Offer.
question.
Yeah.
Because, as we all know, these conditions not only impact the patient, but, those that are around them, particularly like their family or if they have a care partner. So when it comes to care partners, we talked quite a bit today about actually two different concepts. One was accommodations, and those accommodations are afforded under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is called ADA. And then we spent some time today talking about another federal law that's called the Family Medical Leave Act.
Mhm.
And that FMLA is the short name for that. That relates to taking certain leave. And so when we talk about, accommodations, one example of accommodation is medical leave,
Mm.
right? But there are times when you're not seeking an accommodation, but you're just solely seeking medical leave. So for care partners, they wouldn't be seeking an accommodation because accommodations are only for a person with a qualified disability. But a care partner could seek medical leave. In
Mhm.
particular, they could seek medical leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. The Family Medical Leave Act allows someone to seek that protected leave not only for themselves, but also for the care of a family member. Typically, the family member, and I encourage patients to like actually go and look at the Department of Labor's website because the care of a family member, I'm pretty sure it's going to be pretty limited, such as for the care of your parent
Mm.
or child, um, or the care of a service member. So there is a specific scope of who qualifies as a family member, but certainly spouse, child are gonna certainly qualify for that. So the care partner would approach their employer to
Mhm.
say, hey, um, you know, my family member, has this chronic condition for which, they're going to need my assistance. So it's the same kind of process as someone seeking leave for their own care.
Mhm.
There's a required form that the care partner would have to have um, the patient's provider fill out.
Mhm.
So there's going to be sharing of information about the patient's medical condition,
Right.
how long they're going to be out. So, for example, if this care partner is going to be responsible for taking their loved one to doctor's appointments, or let's say they get their infusions at an infusion center,
Mhm.
right? And for those who may live in more rural areas for which they have to travel quite a bit
Mhm.
to get that care, then the care partner would be seeking leave, for travel to and from an infusion center or to a neurological appointment, right? Or if they need to be there when the patient is infusing at home, particularly if the patient gets a lot of side effects, for example. So certainly, a care partner can invoke FMLA leave. And what's special about leave, and something that I failed to mention earlier, is that the reason why you would want to ask for FMLA leave versus just saying, hey, employer, can I take some time off and use like your sick leave or your vacation leave, is because FMLA provides protection. It protects you because an employer cannot um, terminate you while you're on leave. The employer cannot take away your benefits while you're on leave, which is incredibly important.
Yeah.
If you just opted to say, "Hey, I'm going to just use my vacation time,"
Yeah.
that doesn't give you the same protections as FMLA leave does. So I highly recommend that you go that route.
Yeah. Are
Um,
there a certain amount of weeks that FML offers or
Yeah,
recommends?
so
Okay,
it's FMLA qualifies for 12 weeks of unpaid leave.
12 weeks. Okay.
But the beauty of FMLA is you don't have to take the 12 weeks in a big chunk.
Okay.
You can have what's called intermittent leave. So
Mm.
let's take a hypothetical patient who has infusions every 3 weeks. So they would be entitled to, let's say you do your infusions for 3 days every 3 weeks, then you would take FMLA leave just for those 3 days. And let's say your infusions, just for the sake of this conversation, are only 3 hours. So you would take 3 hours of leave for 3 days, right? And then you'd be working the rest of the time. So you can do that as an
Spread out.
option. Also, it's not necessary. It's not the 12 calendar
Yeah.
weeks.
Yeah.
It's going to be based. It's on a rolling basis. So, we're now in what, October. So it would run from October of 2024, and it might bleed over into 2025. So it's really going to depend upon when you invoke it. And also, I wanted to point out that while FMLA is unpaid, if you are with an employer for which you have paid sick leave or paid vacation time, you can utilize those benefits to fill in the gap so that you're not being in a situation where you're not receiving a paycheck. So something that you need to address with your employer.
And this is all also offered to care partners as well, you're saying, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So would a sibling, do you know offhand if a sibling would be
Let me
under the kind of rules and
let me
regulations of
let
a
me
care
check
partner?
that real quick. I'm
Okay.
not quite
We do have that
sure.
situation we've seen in our community a lot where a sibling is the primary care partner. And if they're not, are there any other resources available for care partners like that that don't quite fill the requirement of FMLA?
Thinking about this, you know, FMLA, it should be for a parent, son, daughter, or spouse.
Okay,
Um, there may be some workarounds I just can't think of at the
okay,
moment.
okay,
But those are usually those, or it could
okay,
be if you have guardianship. If
okay.
a sibling has guardianship,
Hmm.
that might qualify.
Oh, right, okay, that makes sense.
If they have legal guardianship,
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
or it doesn't have to be a biological um, child. It can be adopted children as
Mhm.
well. So there has to be some level of tie. So
Okay,
I'm not sure about the sibling, but I would certainly encourage, if it's a sibling situation, to seek legal advice
okay,
because, oftentimes the legal world can change. There can be
yeah,
new case law that
yeah,
addresses that issue. So
yeah, some
I would
loopholes.
recommend checking in with
Yeah.
counsel or talking to the Department of Labor who
Mhm.
handles FMLA
Okay,
protections.
great, great. So we talked a lot about medical leave. We've talked a lot about accommodations. Any other benefits, any other benefits or resources out there?
Yeah, so first that come to mind, we talked about accommodations under the ADA
Mhm.
and medical leave under the FMLA.
Right.
Those are two federal laws.
Mhm.
I want to point out that some states, including the District of Columbia, they may have equivalent laws. So they may be a little different, but that's another resource
Mhm.
that patients should be thinking about.
Mhm.
Furthermore, some other avenues could be short-term disability, for
Yeah.
example. So, I would encourage the patient to look into whether their employer has short-term disability or long-term disability.
Mhm.
The benefit of those are short-term disability could provide at least a percentage of your pay while you're out. Normally, those type of benefits require you to be out of the workplace for perhaps somewhere between 3 to 7 consecutive days.
Mhm.
It's all going to depend on the particular insurance that your employer negotiated,
Mhm.
but it's usually going to be at least some kind of 7 day period, which would be great for people who, let's say you're newly diagnosed and you were required to be in the hospital for a period of time. So that's an avenue that you
Mhm.
might want to consider. Also, we're talking a lot about some of the physical limitations,
Yeah.
but there may be a situation where there's some more mental
Yeah.
impairments at play, right? Which
Mhm.
it could be from the standpoint of cognitive issues, or now maybe you've been diagnosed with depression or, you know, um, adjustment disorder. Let's say you might get a diagnosis like that when you're newly diagnosed. I mean, I'm no healthcare provider, but and you may need to, seek therapy,
Mhm.
may be placed on, antidepressants or other mental health type
Mhm.
medications. So some employers do have a program that's called EAP or Employment Assistance Program.
Mhm.
A lot of time there may be a host of resources, a lot of times free of cost.
Yeah.
Um, if your employer has such a program, they're usually confidential, it's voluntary. You might want to ask your HR department if that's available, or if your job has a website that lists the benefits available to its employees. That might be something. And I know for me, I did participate and utilize the EAP services. In fact, I, worked with a therapist that helped me navigate the emotions that were associated and the stress associated with negotiating those accommodations with my employer, because I was their first employee
Hmm.
who had requested these kind of accommodations. And it was quite stressful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just really useful to have someone to talk to while I was going through that process, because it was several months. And as I mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
it's going to be ongoing conversations about accommodations and whether they fit the situation, or there's been changes and things like that. So certainly, just another avenue that you might want to explore.
Great. So Michelle, you mentioned coming to the foundation several years ago now, but when you were first diagnosed and trying to find out more information, was there any specific places on our website or any specific conversations or events that you went to that you would recommend other people connect with at the foundation here?
Well, yeah, first and foremost is just the descriptions of the conditions.
Yeah,
That's just,
right there.
that is like number one.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure many of patients, trying to explain even to our family or friends, what this condition is, or even understanding that for ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, that's a wonderful resource that I utilize.
Yeah.
In fact, for me, I wanted some level of transparency with my employer.
Mhm.
So when I did request accommodations, like I said, I had my neurologist write a letter, and then I kind of also created a little memo of
Mm.
myself that said, this is what I'm thinking. I took a little snippet of the foundation's website describing the condition. And
Mhm.
then I actually, told my employer, hey, if you'd like more information, you know, please visit the foundation's website.
Yeah.
So that was definitely, really useful for me
Yeah.
in articulating, what this was, what it meant,
Yeah.
and, just a really great resource in that realm. And then, my participation in various foundation events, has, helped me connect with patients all over the world.
Yeah.
And, collaborating with other patients is, not only just from a personal standpoint of, not feeling alone but it's a good resource to trade ideas.
Yeah.
There might be
Absolutely.
other patients that have already gone through this journey of seeking, medical leave or seeking accommodations, and they can share, their experience with this with you, which is just another great resource. So I definitely,
Absolutely.
encourage talking to others, even in talking to your neurologist or other healthcare provider, because they may have other patients in which have gone down this path. In fact, I've um, had chances where I've, talked to, patients of my neurologist who my neurologist will give them my contact information if they feel comfortable, chatting with me.
Yeah.
And we, kind of share experiences. And so, yeah, I definitely encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you're walking the same walk, so to speak, as these other patients, and no one will know more about the journey than someone who's walked the same path
Right.
themselves, right? So Michelle, I'm going to give you the final words here. Is there anything that we missed today or any other resources you wanted to bring up, for our folks today?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I
Yeah.
would also recommend another website as it relates to family medical leave,
Hmm.
and that's the Department of Labor.
Yeah.
The Department of Labor is a federal agency who oversees FMLA, and they have free resources as well to kind of explain, what your entitlements are to, things of that nature. So that's also a wonderful resource. And then, just the takeaway that I want, those who are listening to this webinar is be proactive. Just as we talk about, getting the care that you need from healthcare providers, you have to be an advocate for yourself. And, it's incredibly important when you're thinking about seeking leave or accommodations to, advocate for yourself and be equipped with as much information as you can so that you can really have, informed conversations with your employers and make informed decisions about what would work best for you. So that certainly, is something that, I definitely want to emphasize. And, you know, just emphasize also that you're not alone in this journey. There are countless people who have, they're walking the same path as you. And, don't be afraid to reach out, to get the support that you need, even if it's just to vent or bounce around ideas. And just keep moving forward.
Absolutely. Great, great advice, Michelle. And there's no greater self-advocate mentor than you. So we really appreciate you joining us today. We really appreciate you diving deep into this topic. It's really important. We'll go through and pull out all of these wonderful resources that Michelle provided today, and we'll send it out with the video tomorrow, which will be October 2nd. But Michelle, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who is watching. Please contact the foundation if you have any questions, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Take
thanks.
care.
Bye-bye.